Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Stuart Reid, and I have the privilege of being joined by three esteemed professors of political science and international relations who have also contributed to a stellar package in Foreign Affairs magazine that I highly recommend. So we have Steve Brooks of Dartmouth College, Tanisha Fazal of University of Minnesota, and Manjari Chatterjee Miller of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining me. The three of you have contributed to a package in the July-August 2024 edition of Foreign Affairs that we called The Real Rules of International Relations. And the idea behind the package was to link often abstract-seeming theories of international relations to actual policymaking decisions and issues in the real world. And the result, I highly recommend that everyone dig into this. I think professors should be adding it to their syllabi. We have Karen Yarhi-Milo on credibility and how much leaders' perceptions of reputations for credibility matters. We have Charles Glazer on the security dilemma, Michael Doyle on the democratic peace theory, and then the three professors I'm joined with, Manjari Chatterjee Miller on power transitions, Steve Brooks on economic interdependence, and Tanisha Fazal on norms. And all three of their essays are focusing on system level factors and ultimately asking the question, when and when do they not matter and prevent war? And so I'm thrilled to be talking with all of them. I will just dive right in. First question is for Manjari. One of the oldest rules of international relations theory is that when you have a rising challenger coming up against a dominant hegemon, the result is war. And that goes back to Thucydides, who famously wrote that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. But you argue very interestingly that it's not just about the ambitions of the challenger. It also matters how the status quo power reacts to that challenge. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So Stuart, first of all, thank you for having me. I loved writing that piece. I thought it was an incredible issue because I think, to my knowledge, that's the first time that Foreign Affairs has really brought together theories of IR and how they matter. And honestly, I tell my students this all the time. International relations theories are really important for understanding policy, and they're not abstract. They're not just floating around. They have real world implications. And so the fact that we actually got to write that and show that in the pieces, I thought was fantastic. So kudos to you and the Foreign Affairs team for doing that. The question you ask is really interesting and important because power transition theory dates back to Thucydides. It's been around forever, and then it was taken up again during the Cold War. And it's really about saying, look, there's this recurring cycle in international relations. You always, in the history of the world, you've always had a great power, which is a status quo power. And then you have an upstart challenger. And then when the challenger, challenges essentially the great power, you have war. And so this cycle just continues over and over again. And what I argue in the piece is that if you really read power transition theory carefully, what matters isn't simply how the status quo power responds to the challenger, leading to war, but rather how the status quo power manages the international order. And that's the underpinning of power transition theory that we don't talk so much about. We really talk about, if you take something like the US and China, really talk about China challenging the United States. But we don't talk about the fact that the United States management of the international order is as important as the United States response to China. And there's really two reasons for this. The first is because, by definition, when you have a challenger, they don't yet have the ability to set the norms of order, right? So those are rising powers. They're not established great powers, which means that they're often constrained by the international norms that exist, even when they don't want to be. And the second part of that, the corollary, is that status quo powers, which is the great power, has the ability to adjust the rules of the international order in ways that benefit and sustain them, mainly because they've created the rules, right? So this is why this idea of the status quo power managing the international order, rather than simply responding to what the challenger is doing, is actually a fundamental tenet in power transition theory, but not very much studied and quite consistently overlooked.
Steve, another shibboleth of US foreign policy is that economic interdependence, trade, financial ties between countries, and so on, binds countries together so that they will have less of an incentive to go to war. As you write in your piece, this was one reason that the United States wanted to bring China into the World Trade Organization, for example. Your answer to the question of whether economic interdependence promotes peace is essentially it's complicated. Explain what we know about when interdependence does and does not promote peace.
Well, it's a big question, in part because the global economy is a big dynamic force. It has different elements. And in some respects, given how complex the global economy is, it's kind of surprising that we would ever expect it to have a single overarching effect on world politics. It clearly doesn't have an overarching effect on anything else. I mean, it's good in some respects for some people's welfare. It's harmful for others. And so a big takeaway of the article is just that the global economy really does matter. However, it's not going to matter in a single unidirectional effect. Over history, I think the perspective that's been most talked about is the kind of liberal view, which would expect that if you have more trade, if you have a more integrated global economy, then peace is more likely. But that's not the only perspective that exists. The other significant perspective actually predicts the exact opposite. So, lots of realists, Marxists, some policymakers expected the global economy to be harmful, in terms of the relations between states. And so what's kind of strange to me is that, you had this debate and some people are like, it's all good. Other people saying it's all bad. And my underlying conclusion is once I looked at the global economy in more detail, I found that it's good in some ways and bad in others. And to say, how that works in a few minutes is difficult. But what I would say is what I like to do is I like to think of the global economy as having three main components. It's got a trade component, it's got a finance component, and it's got a production component. The production component is multinational corporations producing different things in different parts of the world. With respect to trade, the relationship, for a forthcoming book, I looked at every study on all of these things that have ever been published. And with respect to trade, there's around 60 of those studies, and they produce very mixed effects. Some find it enhances conflict. Some find it has a mixed effect in conflict. Some find it has beneficial effects in terms of peace. So basically, there's no clear storyline that we can tell for trade. For finance, we don't really have any storyline either. And there, the issue is that investors don't react in a single common way to war. An argument has been made that investors will kind of punish countries for going to war, and the evidence is just not there, at least for the long term. The clearest story that I have found, which actually draws on my first book from like 20 years ago, is that the production activities of multinational corporations do have a stabilizing effect among the great powers. And I can go into why that is. But at the same time, it doesn't have a stabilizing effect for security relations among developing countries. So basically, the answer is that, as you said, it is complicated. And what that demands is just actually from the policymaking world, a lot more nuanced and a lot more thinking about how economics affect security. There's not a single kind of easy recipe that we can just plug in.
Tanisha, I'm hoping you can give me a simple, easy recipe that we can plug in. And so your essay is about, it tackles the question of norms, which are, of course, the ideas and principles that theoretically restrain states' behavior, acting as a brake on actions they might otherwise take. And I think, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought this issue to the fore naturally. And, one argument would say, well, what good is the norm against the invasion of sovereign territory if, it clearly didn't stop Russia from doing that in Ukraine. But in your essay, you argue interestingly that, what Russia paid an extremely high price for this invasion, and that's where the power of norms comes in. Tell us a little bit about how the invasion may changed or didn't change your thinking about the power of norms, and what it might be like in a world where there were no norms against seizing sovereign territory. What would have happened then?
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks also for hosting and for inviting me on the panel. I will say that writing this paper really forced me to grapple with and to articulate how I think about norms, especially in light of recent events like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as other ongoing wars, which is a hard thing to do because I think norms are a phenomena that don't really lend themselves to precision. So I want to start with definitions and kind of push back a little bit against the definition that you offered of norms as a constraint. So norms can be a constraint, but really, I think more broadly, norms are about how you ought to behave, which also includes how you should not behave, depending on who you are. So, the canonical definition is that a norm is a standard of appropriate behavior for an actor with a given identity. And, the way I always talk about it with my students is to say that as a professor, so I'm an actor with a given identity, if I showed up to class in my pajamas, that would be a violation of a norm. Norms have always been part of international relations. They govern everything from what counts as a state, which is definitely a question that's arisen in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, to how belligerents ought to comport themselves in war. And we tend to think about norms as forces for good, but the reality is that there are plenty of, quote unquote, bad norms out there. Western Europeans for a very long time had a norm of civilizing colonized people. But it is true, I think, that the norms that we tend to focus or service today do tend to touch on issues like human rights, protecting human rights, sovereignty norms. There are efforts to develop new norms around cyber, AI, climate change, even, which would be an interesting thing to talk about. But the question, and I think this is really what you were asking, is how much do norms really constrain international actors? And I think here, one thing I would say, and one argument I make in the article is that it's really important to distinguish between international law and international norms. They often overlap, but they're not exactly the same. But really, if we want to assess the strength of a norm, we need to look not only at direct behavior, which is, did Russia violate a norm in invading Ukraine? Yes, but also to responses to the violations. And I think this is here where you sort of get a much better sense of sort of the spectrum of norm strength. And if there had been no responses to Russia's violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, then I think we would be gauging the strength of the norm, lower than if there had been a response. And there has been a response, but it's certainly not been as strong as you might have expected. So the bottom line here for me, and the argument that I'm trying to make in the article, is that norms matter, but the ways in which they matter can be subtle. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm giving a similar answer to Steve in terms of his response regarding interdependence and trade.
Let's turn to one of the biggest questions of U.S. foreign policy at the moment, which is what to do about China. Manjari, I'm going to ask you this question. So the rivalry between China and the United States seems to be, in many ways, a classic case of power transition theory in action. You have a rising power, China, challenging a status quo one, the United States. Are we indeed in a power transition with China? And given your research on this and the argument you're making in your foreign affairs essay, how do you think the United States should think about the challenge that China poses and react to it in its policies?
I would love to say that I know exactly what we should do about China. I'd be a millionaire and not professor at the University of Toronto. But the reality is that, one of the things that international relations theory has struggled with is to define exactly when we're in a power transition, right? Because it assumes that we can measure exactly who's a rising power, who's a declining power, and who's actually maintaining their position. But from what we can see, we definitely know a few things. We know that China is rising, right? Will it rise to become a great power, or is it already declining? Those are debatable questions, and we can even get into that in Q&A. But there are measures that show that China's material power is changing, and China's influence is changing, right? We know that the United States was, a superpower during the Cold War. Has it maintained that position? Again, that's a question that's up for debate. But we know that even now, the United States power outstrips China. So it's all relative, right? But I think where it's become really interesting about management is that really, when we talk about China today, we really talk about the United States responding to China and Chinese actions. And I can give you a very concrete example of that. So if you take something like the Belt and Road Initiative, which I talk about in my article, the United States is very worried about the Belt and Road Initiative, and it struggled to actually respond to the Belt and Road Initiative and brainstorm ways that it can respond. So, for example, one of the things that the United States has talked about is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, where the G7 has pledged $600 billion to actually kind of not replicate, but provide something close to the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, it's run into a whole host of troubles, including not only domestic political constraints, but also just the ability to control how the private sector invests, right? Now, the thing is, this is really problematic because, and I showed this in my most recent book, Why Nations Rise, is that when you have rising powers, initially rising powers are rising within the context, within the rules and norms that Tanisha talked about of the international order that have been created by the great power, right? So they have to rise by those rules. So that if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't violate the rules of the multilateral order, right? It is a multilateral institution. It rose by those norms. It was created by those norms. So the BRI itself is not a violation of the international order. So to provide something that then matches BRI, which is not the United States' strength because we don't do infrastructure investment very well, becomes really problematic. So how does the United States respond? Well, here the question is about rethinking, right, some of the issue areas in order that the United States created. And I think this is where there's a need to think out of the box, like how can the United States respond when it comes to China? One of the ways that comes to mind, for example, is about education. I mean, the United States is still a global leader in education. It has the edge in science and technology. China is catching up, but it hasn't yet. So could the United States create something in a different issue area that doesn't involve replicating what the Belt and Road offers? So I think that's where the challenge really primarily has been for the United States, because often it'll respond to Chinese initiatives by saying, well, this violates the rules-based order. But it doesn't necessarily. Just because China is doing it doesn't mean it violates the rules-based order. The question is, what can the United States offer, perhaps by even rethinking some of the rules that it created? That is not just an alternative, but a new way to think about the utility of the United States in the world and what it has to offer.
And just to follow up on that quickly, Manjari, in your essay, you argue that status quo powers can, like the United States, use the international order itself to constrain the rising power. What would that mean in the case of China?
Well, actually, Nisha just talked about it, right? So emerging tech, for example, is a completely new area. There are no norms around it that have been created, right? So how the United States creates those norms around things like AI or, even issue area threats like cybersecurity will matter a lot. For institutions going forward. It will then breed institutions that respond to those norms. So how we do that, I think, is really important. I don't know that's been really thought through yet. I would just add one more thing that, there are some ways that you can see the US already beginning to do this. So, for example, I think one of the ways that the United States has done this is minilaterals, right? That's a new concept. Whether you have in the past when we talked about the multilateral world order, it was really about liberal economic institutions, and then of course you had alliances, right, like NATO or whatever, that was security alliances. But now you see the concept of minilaterals that are neither entirely economic institutions nor entirely security institutions, right? So the Quad is one. Does the Quad have teeth? Not yet. But the point is that foundation exists, or AUKUS, right? So these ideas of minilaterals are actually new. And that is a different way of thinking about a response to international order that hasn't been done before. So you do see some of those steps and that rethinking happening, but it's not quite there yet.
Steve, the United States and China are extremely economically interdependent, or at least they have been in the past. And now, of course, there's this move, arguably on both sides, towards sort of decoupling and self-sufficiency and de-risking. So my question for you is, was economic interdependence the thing that was keeping the peace, relatively speaking, between Washington and Beijing? And could the undoing of it increase the odds of war?
Well, let me cut into the question a little different way, which is, I think that people thought before that, if we just open up to China and everything's going to be fine. And so therefore, kind of like as much openness as possible is great. And now the pendulum's kind of, in my view, swung too far the other direction, in the view that, where we really should, think about cutting off China a lot. And I think that there is a middle ground Goldilocks perspective, and that would be to say there are some forms of economic integration with China which would be harmful for our security. And the notable area that policymakers have focused on in the past few years is semiconductors. And I think that makes a lot of sense, as an area where we'd say trade here in that area, completely open trade, that is harmful. But a lot of people want to take that approach, the so-called small yard, high fence, and they want to broaden it. They want to say, also, we need to protect solar panels. Also, we need to protect, and build up, raw materials industries. And what I would say is that right now we're in danger of kind of cutting off trade in too many areas. And I say that from a lot of different perspectives, in the sense of, I think it'd be harmful to our growth and to China's, but I also think it'd be actually harmful to our security. Because in my view, you want to do, if I was a policymaker, putting myself in their shoes, I want to be telling China a very clear story, which is, look, if you don't, invade Taiwan and or engage in significant revisionism, there is a benefit, which is you will have substantial access to the global economy. On the other hand, if you were to engage in very significant revisionism, then that access to the global economy would be significantly curtailed. But you can't say that if you've already cut them off. You have to have a basis for doing that, and a basis for kind of encouraging China to be acting in a way which is supportive of the norm that Tanisha has been talking about. The other thing I'd say is that I've done a lot of, I have a new book, won't talk about, but it actually models in terms of what would happen if the US and its allies were to cut off China, if it were to invade Taiwan. I'm not advocating for this, but we just modeled it. And what it basically showed is it makes no sense for the US to be cutting off China unilaterally. If we cut off China unilaterally, then they're hurt, just a little bit more than we are. However, if the US were to, with its allies, cut off China, then China is damaged in this massive, disproportionate way. Depending upon the scenario, China's harmed either 5 times more than the United States or 11 times more than the United States. So if you buy that analysis, and if you buy the fact that we can only cut off China once, then the view would be is that we should only think about really cutting them off in a situation where we could do this with our allies And the point of the matter is that that's only going to be in the most extreme kind of circumstances, conquest, use of nuclear weapons. And we're not anywhere near that point yet. And so therefore, I think Washington, whatever party wins the next election, will have to think about actually restraining the desire to cut China off. And for me, there's a national security reason for doing that. And I think that once you recognize this, then it kind of strangely brings together two different camps, which is the kind of like, well, we'd like there to be something called globalization. And at the same time, we are concerned about China. It turns out you can bring those two perspectives together if you recognize that you should cut it off only in their extreme circumstances.
Tanisha, China is arguably violating a lot of norms. Its territorial claims in the South China Sea come to mind, most obviously. But as Beijing is fond of pointing out, the United States hasn't exactly had a sterling record on upholding norms. The invasion of Iraq comes to mind. Tell us about China's relationship with norms. It seems to simultaneously violate them itself and then complain about their violation of others.
Well, I don't think China's an exception in this regard. I think that this is something that we see oftentimes when it comes to norms. But you're right that certainly when we think about sovereignty norms, there's a kind of an apparent hypocrisy, but oddly in ways that it at the same time acknowledges this set of norms and the importance of sovereignty norms. Because on the one hand, Beijing would refuse any possible intrusions on its own sovereignty from another country. That would be unacceptable. But on the other hand, as you noted, there's a very clear desire to expand China's borders beyond the status quo with respect to Taiwan and also with respect to these maritime regions. But to me, what's interesting is that in making these claims, China is oftentimes invoking sovereignty norms. So they're using the language of sovereignty to justify their own behavior. But I also think that we see this not just, when it comes to China with respect to sovereignty, but also when it comes to discussions about human rights, right? Where China is often seen as being on the back foot. And I think that what we see sometimes is the Chinese kind of challenging the premise of the question, where they're objecting to a Western version of human rights. This I think goes also to Manjari's point about how China is not yet able to set the terms of international order, of which these norms are part. For me, one of the projects I've been working on recently is trying to think through what the term international community means. And thinking that through, what I found was that Xi Jinping has been kind of shopping around an alternative term. He doesn't like the term international community because I think that for him, it connotes all the norms that are kind of packaged in the Western order. And instead, he prefers the term community of shared future for all mankind. And then I'll just mention one other area, which I think is really interesting to think about with respect to international norms in China in particular, and that's climate change and the question of who is responsible for climate change and what that responsibility means. So China is, of course, in absolute terms, the world's biggest emitter, not in per capita terms, that's us, the US, but very much wants to kind of count itself as part of the global South and shift responsibility for the climate crisis to the global North. But at the same time, I think you're starting to see some movement from a lot of people and countries in the global South that are a little bit uncomfortable being grouped with China in this regard and really feel that China, along with countries like the US and Western Europe, should be held responsible for the emissions that they have produced already and frankly, the climate crisis writ large. And I think it'll be interesting to see how and whether strong norms emerge regarding how rich industrialized countries compensate poor developing economies on this front.
That's interesting, Tanisha. You've touched on something that, as an editor, I've thought a lot about, which is when authors use the term international community, they often actually just mean the West, or sometimes they mean, the United States. And so Xi Jinping has a point there, I think. We're about to turn to audience questions, but I just wanted, Manjari, to get your take on something I've been wondering about really quickly, which is how Russia fits into the question of power transition theory. President Obama famously dismissed it as a regional power. Many have argued that it's a declining power and that, Putin's ambitions exceed his actual power. Does power transition theory, or perhaps other work that you've done, have anything to tell us about what happens on the way down?
It does, actually. It's the flip side of power transition theory, and Jack Levy has written on it a long time ago. So the flip side to power transition theory is essentially saying that, look, it's not. Okay, let me restate power transition theory, right? You have a status quo power, you have a rising power. The rising power wants to set the rules of international order. The status quo power wants to stop it, and therefore you have war. Now, the flip side of power transition theory is that you have war because a declining power wants to maintain its position, right? And so Jack Levy's theory is really about preventive war. And what he says is that essentially the declining power has a preventive motivation for war because its military power, its potential is declining relative to that of another power. And so the goal is to fight a war now while the circumstances are still favorable, then do it later when the status quo has declined completely. Now, the reason this is interesting with respect to Russia is, I think, in some respects, you could say, well, Russia is a declining power, and perhaps Ukraine can be explained by preventive war theory. Personally, I think it's also problematic because Russia is by many measures a declined power, not just a declining power, but a declined power. And so, whether the fact that it's shrunken geographically in terms of its influence, its terms of its tech leadership, right? And Russia has declined. And so then this gets to, well, is this really the kind of systemic war that power transition theory envisions, or are we really getting closer to the definition that President Obama was talking about, is that this is a very regional conflict with global implications, but a regional conflict nonetheless?
Thank you. Now we'll turn it over to the audience. We're going to have a mix of written questions and live questions. And for the live questioners, I would just implore you to keep your question very short and make sure it's actually a question, not a statement. So with that, we'll turn it over to the audience.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to ask a question, please click on the raise hand icon on your Zoom window. When you are called on, please accept the unmute now button and proceed with your name, affiliation, and question. You may also type in your question using the Q&A box on your Zoom window at any time. As a reminder, this meeting is on the record. We'll take our first question from Lars Cederquist, who asks, Dr. Brooks writes, great powers that launch wars of aggression, for example, could lose access to international supply chains. What does China need that they cannot get from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and to a lesser extent, India and South America?
Where to begin? In my view, one way to think about this would be to think about products and technologies as having four different kinds, various levels of complexity. At the lowest level of complexity, it's something so simple that basically anyone at any time can do. Any country can make it. The next level of complexity would be something like solar panels, which has like 20 parts, and you can look online about how to make them. They're not very complicated. They can be made very easily. The third level of complexity would be something like cars. Cars have 30,000 parts, much more complex than solar panels. But one thing about cars is that they're not things you need to make perfectly. We all have driven in cars or been in cars that the brakes don't work exactly right, or there's a knocking in the engine. And, so that's the third level. The highest level of complexity would be something like commercial jet aircraft or semiconductors. And as an example of how complex those things are, the machine that is used to make the most advanced semiconductor chips, the lithography machine, which is made by the Dutch company ASML. That machine, just the laser within it, has roughly 457,000 parts. Just the laser, and that's just one part of it, And so that machine, which is made by a Dutch company, the Dutch company actually only itself supplies about 15% of the parts that goes into that machine. The other 85% are coming from the rest of the world. And when they're coming from the rest of the world, really what we're talking about is the United States, Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, not India, for the most part, not Russia, not China. And so the point is, if you want to make a very complex technology, like a commercial aircraft or advanced semiconductors, you need access to the United States, to Japan, to Taiwan, to South Korea, and so forth. India, Russia just will not cut it. They are just not technologically advanced enough. They do not have this kind of firms that supply those kinds of things. And so basically, for anything that's very complex, my prediction would be if China tries to make that without having any access to the United States and its allies, then it will not make the thing very well, and it will be extraordinarily expensive to make it, and it will have to be devoting tons of money and personnel to make that thing, which means that those monies and people won't be available for lots of other things. So basically, anything super complex, China needs the US and its allies to make it.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question.
We'll take another written question from Nick Bovey Gazette at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And he asks, how are recent developments in emerging technologies, i.e. AI, drones, synthetic biology, etc., changing the rules of international relations, or are they?
Nisha, that to me sounds like a norms question, so I'm going to kick that to you.
Okay, I'll do my best. So I think that there are a lot of efforts to rethink international norms in light of these new technologies. There are also a lot of efforts to rethink international law in light of these new technologies. So on the international law front, for example, there's the Tallinn Manual, which is it's not a treaty. It's a group of international lawyers who were convened in Tallinn, Estonia, to think through how existing international humanitarian law could be applied in the cyber space. So I think but I think that the challenge here is that the technologies are changing so quickly. It's certainly very difficult for the law to keep up with them. And so I think there maybe is a little bit more success on the norms front in terms of thinking through general principles. But if someone who's done a fair amount of work on international humanitarian law, which again, not always coterminous with international norms, it is striking to me that a lot of times international laws regarding how certain technologies are used in war are written kind of at the end of a war to prohibit or govern the use of a particular technology. And they tend to be backward looking rather than forward looking. And so it's very interesting to kind of see this evolution that is a little bit more forward looking, asking questions like, who do you hold responsible for AI in war, right? And I don't think we have answers to that, but people are asking the questions.
Just to put a finer point on that, Tanisha, is what you're saying that it's all well and good to try and come up with prospective norms, but maybe it will take, if you are going to have a really strong norm on drones, for example, it'll take some major conflict that involves them where both sides or the winning side has a particular interest in setting a norm. Does norm creation require sort of world historical events like World War II, which I think was the last round of norm creation?
I don't know that it requires it. I think that, we do have existing norms and also existing laws that are based on principles where you can sort of derive corollaries from them that could apply in these new spaces. And so I think that it's kind of in between.
Great. Let's go to the next question.
We'll take our next written question from Ben Chow, who asks, a lot of the discussion so far has focused on international norms, but I think it's telling that we haven't had much talk of the United Nations, despite the fact that the United States led the creation of the UN and that China has invested significantly in influencing and shaping it. What's the future of the United Nations, and what role should it play in our foreign policy?
Manjari, this is to me a question about the order, because the UN system is obviously one part of that. What's your answer to the big question, future of UN, and how it relates to US foreign policy?
I think it's a great question. And the reason it's a great question is because I think the United Nations is not very well regarded in the United States, but it's hugely important for global South countries. And I think the reason the United Nations is important is because it allows countries to point to the UN as a place where they can burnish reputations, right? By, for example, voting in certain ways, where they can build coalitions, and where they can gather to discuss issues that may not be as much of importance to the United States, but are very important to those nations. So I think the United Nations gives global South countries a forum by which they can come together. And even if, the General Assembly resolutions lack teeth, there is a reputational cost that happens if you're condemned in the United Nations. And I think we underestimate the UN in that sense. And of course, one way to think about it is imagine a world without a United Nations, right? And that's kind of difficult to imagine, and it's a little scary. And so there is that sense that exists that the United Nations is there as one forum that exists for everybody. And you can see some of this play out in certain ways. So for example, when India wants a permanent seat on the Security Council, sure, it comes with a veto, which is really great. But it's not just that, right? It's the reputation that it would have if it were to be a permanent member of the Security Council, a recognition that this is a rising power, this is going to be a great power, and it is a state that has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, has not signed the CTBT, but still has sanctioned nuclear weapons, right? So that reputational aspect to it is hugely important. And yes, it comes with a veto, which is also very nice. And the United States recognizes that India wants that and supports it. And China recognizes that this would be a disaster for China, and doesn't want to recognize it, right? So you can see those things play out in the United Nations reputationally. And I think that's one of the reasons why it continues to be quite important.
And let's go to the next question.
We'll take our next live question from Khadijah Taylor. Please remember to state your affiliation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Khadijah Taylor. I'm a former intern at the Council on Foreign Relations, fall 2021, in the Meetings and Membership Department. So I came here today thinking panelists would discuss the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The state of Israel violates international laws as we speak, killing 20,000 children in 10 months. And all those children are under the age of 10 years old. Why is Israel allowed to violate international law? It's obvious that Palestine's power is declining, but at the price of genocide? Where are the norms of morality, and will it ever be a priority in international law? Is power more important than life? How is the lack of morality and sense of humanity different from the false assumptions people made and make about Islam not valuing human life? Isn't that hypocrisy? Is international law run and supported by hypocrites?
Tanisha, why don't I pass a version of that question to you, which is, after the Israel-Hamas war, in what shape do you think norms will be? How has this particular conflict affected the normative architecture, and where will we be after that conflict, when it does end?
Yeah, thanks. And Khadija, thank you for the question. I just want to acknowledge that I hear the passion in your voice, and very much I think we all know and understand the passion and the tragedy of this moment. You asked a lot of questions, but I think that here's how I think about this set of issues. There's no doubt that Israel is violating international humanitarian law and norms in its war in Gaza. I will say that it's interesting, I think, to think about this also with respect to Hamas, because you asked, why is Israel allowed to violate international law? And I want to unpack that question a little bit. First, by saying that international law was and is designed principally by states for states. And so what that means is that it can be harder to hold non-state actors accountable, although it's also clear that Hamas has violated international law and norms. But it also means that international law, by design, is always going to be a little bit weak because states don't want to constrain themselves, right? I think that when we think about international norms, that is a related but somewhat distinct question, because as I mentioned earlier, there's an overlap oftentimes between international law and international norms, but they're not the same thing. And so if we think about international norms as a standard of behavior that actors are supposed to abide by, actors of a certain identity are supposed to abide by, I think where we're seeing the strength of international norms regarding civilian targeting, regarding protection of life, regarding protection of institutions like hospitals, issues like infrastructural targeting, is in the court of global public opinion. And I think that the very strong response that we've seen in the global court of public opinion, particularly from the global South, but not only, regarding Israeli conduct, is actually a sign that these norms maintain a certain sense of robustness, even if, as Ona Hathaway wrote in a relatively recent Foreign Affairs article, the law has failed. With that said, we don't know as much about norm decline as we do about the creation or the rise of specific norms. And so really for me, the question is, if you see a norm that's being challenged and there aren't negative reactions to violations of the norm, or those negative reactions are insufficiently robust, then I do worry about the health and the future of that norm or set of norms.
Thank you. Let's turn to the next question.
We'll take our next written question from Sean Spada, who asks, as the BRICS summit continues this week, how does the United States adequately measure the power of its minilaterals against others, especially when entities in those minilaterals are a part of seemingly competing objectives?
Steve, you've written a lot about multipolarity, relative power. Why don't you take a stab at that question?
One thing to think about is for any grouping like BRICS, it's going to have aspirations, things it would like to do, and then later it's going to have results. And oftentimes the situation is the results are much less significant than the aspirations. And I think in the BRICS case, the real issue is that there's a tension between making it big in terms of lots of countries and making it cohesive enough that it can really do anything. And right now, for whatever reason, the countries in this grouping have decided they want to make it big because they want people to pay attention to it. But the problem is, in making it big, you have countries like Russia and China that would be, willing to take steps which would make the United States and its allies mad, perhaps. But you also have other countries, like India, South Africa, who don't want to do this. And so my guess is that, for the BRICS, there's going to be lots of discussion of what it might do. And it's going to seem really potentially significant, but it's actually going to amount to a lot less than this. Interestingly, one way to think about this is that, the United States obviously has a group also. It has its allies, and the United States was very powerful. And after the Cold War ended, and it tried to do a fair number of things with its group, and it got some things done, but not a huge number of things. And so I think when we look at that experience, we should kind of temper our expectation of how much the BRICS can do, especially given that it's a much more diverse grouping than the US and its allies.
Manjari, you're an expert on the I and C of BRICS. What do you make of the organization?
I agree with Steve. I think that the outcomes are not the same, and don't live up to the expectations that we would have of the BRICS. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to have that because you have countries in the grouping, even founding countries, obviously China and India, that have a terrible relationship. So, but that isn't to say, I would say that I depart a little bit, because that isn't to say that the BRICS institution is not useful. And I wrote a piece for this, for Foreign Policy Magazine a couple of years ago. I think the BRICS does matter. It provides a mode of cooperation for China and India and Russia that wouldn't exist if that institution was not there, right? So whether it's on things of common issue areas like trafficking, drug trafficking, right? That's something that's of mutual interest to those countries. There isn't conflict around that. And so sharing intelligence on drug trafficking is something that can be done through the BRICS. So institutions, I'm a firm believer in international institutions, so I'll just go on the record saying that. I think they do matter because they provide different avenues of cooperation. So yes, are you going to see the outcome that the BRICS was originally founded for, which is to provide, an alternative to Western modes of global governance? No, we don't see that yet. And as the BRICS expands, we're going to probably see that less, as Steve points out, because it's going to be unwieldy. But that doesn't mean that that is necessarily the only outcome that defines an institution as successful.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question.
We'll take our next written question from Jim Barnett, who asks, how vulnerable is the dollar to being replaced in its role as the currency of international trade? And what are the implications of such a change?
Steve, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I don't think it's vulnerable at all. To make a clear, strong answer. Before I wasn't able to give a clear, strong answer about how the global economy affects security, but on this, I can give a clear answer. It's not vulnerable at all, at least probably in my lifetime, because there's no alternative to it. There has to be an alternative to the dollar to replace it. And right now, it's not going to be the euro, in part because the EU is becoming more fractious and less cohesive. And so you're not, as an investor or a business or anyone else, going to be saying, I'm fully confident that the euro is even going to be here, let alone that it's going to be something that I can make the reserve currency. And it can't be China's currency because China doesn't have open capital markets. You have to have open capital markets to be the world's reserve currency. Interestingly, before the crackdown in Hong Kong, I would have been less confident in saying that the dollar couldn't be challenged, because the other thing that you would need to challenge the dollar is you have to have a rival financial center to New York, which does the same kind of things that it does, has very liquid, deep capital markets. Hong Kong could have provided that. potentially. However, with China essentially taking it over, it can't, in my view, perform that role anymore because investors have learned that essentially property rights are not respected by the current Chinese government. And that's the fundamental building block that you would need to have a financial center. So, bottom line, I mean, we can see weaknesses in the US for sure. And if there was someone else out there that didn't have weaknesses also on the economic realm and it also had open capital markets, then you could perhaps see this. But there's no alternative. And then there's also just the force of path dependency. It is powerful. Great Britain, the pound remained as the reserve currency for decades after Great Britain was no longer the leading state. So there you go.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe two if we're quick, probably one. So let's see what the next question is.
R.A. Stone asks, given very different approaches by the major parties and personalities involved, what will IR norms look like? How will current norms evolve depending on the results of the current U.S. election cycle?
Nisha?
I mean, norms tend to be fairly slow-moving phenomena, so I think it's hard to say. I do think that, it's pretty clear that a Trump administration is probably, just given the previous Trump administration and what we hear, there's going to be less commitment to, for example, the norm against territorial conquest, because it seems to me quite likely that a second Trump administration would be pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table and pushing Ukraine to accept having lost certain amounts of territory. And I think that, there are lots of norms around warfare in particular that I think here we wouldn't necessarily see those norms valued, but particularly by a Trump administration. There would be other considerations that they would prioritize. But then the question then is, can the norm survive the U.S. pulling back from it? And that's an open question. And I think it really does depend on how the rest of the world would respond.
Let's try and sneak in one more question very quickly in our final minutes here.
We'll take our next question from Owen, who asks, is part of the problem in international relations that status quo powers aren't willing to modify the rules of the international order? The status quo powers seem to be open to letting rising powers in if the rising powers don't wish to change any of the rules.
Manjari?
Yes, thank you for the question. Are status quo powers unwilling to modify the rules of the international order? I think that it's not a question of willingness or unwillingness. If you've created the rules of international order, they're not easy to shift. I think one of the things that we did not talk about today, which is really important, is what is international order, right? So we use that phrase all the time. So international order consists of different issue areas that come together, and then they're bound together by rules and norms, which, Tanisha has been explaining. Now, those rules and norms and institutions, once they're created, they're sticky, right? They're harder to shift. So it's not that a status quo power is unwilling. It's the fact that you have the costs and benefits of shifting rules and norms in international order, which are historically resistant to change, right? And if you've created the order, to think beyond that is also just really hard. The question of letting rising powers in. So do status quo powers let rising powers into the international order? Sometimes they do. I mean, we saw that transition, for example, with the United Kingdom and the United States when it was a rising power, right? It was the United Kingdom was accommodational of the United States' rise. And you can actually argue that in the 1990s, the United States was accommodation of China's rise. I mean, if you remember Robert Zoellick's famous phrase that if the United States were to just integrate China into the liberal international order, China would be a responsible stakeholder and then the underpinning of that was eventually democratize. That was very much an accommodation. But that's not always the case, right? So, and what you see now is definitely not an accommodation of China's rise. So there's no hard and fast rule about when the status quo power lets a rising power in. I think it's about, well, do they want the power transition to be peaceful? How well do they think they can accommodate but yet contain the rising power and then integrate it into the order that the status quo power created?
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to my three distinguished panelists. And I would just reiterate that everyone listening here should, if they haven't already, read all 6 essays in the package. I think there's no better way to understand the role of international relations theory and its relevance in the real world than doing that. Subscribe to Foreign Affairs as well, I can't help but mention. And thank you again to the panelists, and thanks to everyone for joining us and asking such great questions.